Welcome back, I'm Tedward, and thanks to Bond Group in Waltham, Massachusetts, we're driving this 1983 Volkswagen Rabbit GTI, except this isn't any ordinary Rabbit GTI. This has a Stage 2 turbo from Callaway Turbo Systems. And Callaway claimed this made about 200 horsepower from its 1.8 liter four-cylinder, and that's quite a lot in a Volkswagen Rabbit. My goodness, you know, the US did not get the best GTI. In fact, a lot of the Europeans on my last GTI drive complained about the headlights. We've got the square headlights on this one instead of the round headlights. That car had a little more power than we got in the US, but Callaway took care of us because a turbo really does the trick. And it's incredibly fun to hear a wastegate. So first, let me just give you a little tour of the car. Very, very clean. This is cashmere white with red velour interior. We've got the 14-inch snowflake wheels, which are absolutely beautiful. Disc brakes in the front, drums in the rear, 185 section tires. And then inside, this is a very practical vehicle. I would have loved to be driving one of these in the early 80s. And you've got a reasonably roomy back seat. Look at this, the red velour. Ooh, still nice to the touch. Look at this. It's just a little car, and I've got plenty of room. Now, there's a little bit of a sag in this headliner, not a big deal. And if we're talking about wear and tear on a vehicle, I think that's as good as it gets, right? A worn headliner, oof. And it's the perfect hot hatch, the OG hot hatch. And we've got a cover in the back, but plenty of room to fold down your seat, put as much stuff as you want in here. So you might be thinking, how could this car be so clean? Well, it has 19,000 miles on it. Yeah, 19,000. It's incredible. It's amazing what people will maintain and keep perfect. And, you know, it would be hard not to drive this constantly. Anyway, under the hood, this is where we can start to see some fun stuff. You've got the Callaway labeled valve cover. Excellent. And then, of course, we've got our turbo setup with our little intercooler. But I honestly can't even imagine what it would have been like to open the hood to this GTI back in the 80s and show off that Callaway valve cover. This must have really turned some heads back then. Now, the current owner bought it on Bring a Trailer, and that made some waves because it sold for quite a bit of money. I'll let you go ahead and look that up yourself. But not only did he buy the car, he put a little money into it. And underneath this car, it is unbelievably immaculate now. So everything has been coated. This is really preserved for the next generation or 3 or 4 or 5. So let's go pop in our classic Volkswagen key and go for a drive. Hear what this turbo wastegate sounds like, because my goodness, is this a cool thing. Make sure our classic golf ball shifter is in neutral. Good, good. Springs right to life. And you'll notice we've got an additional gauge here, the video boost gauge, sitting next to our radio. Very cool. And the last time we saw something like that was in the 88 Callaway Corvette that I drove. 7,000 RPM redline, but you know what? Hardly need it because there's plenty of torque. And what's amazing, you know what? We'll get out and drive and then we'll talk about it. Roll down windows, we love that. We'll do a little windows down action for the beginning because I want you to hear the full effect of the turbo and the wastegate. No power steering, so it's a bit heavy at low speeds, especially when you're trying to make sharp corners like a U-turn or something. But obviously, it's a light car, so you're not too worried. It also has an upgraded clutch from Callaway, so that way it can handle the additional torque. You definitely don't want to go and put a bunch more torque and power into a car that was only rated for around 100 horsepower, double it, and then expect it to survive. So that's very cool. Roll into it in second gear. It's incredible, the top end of this car. And when that turbo comes on, it just feeds power. It's fantastic. There's not a big surge where boom, it hits. It's actually relatively linear, which I guess speaks to maybe the size of the turbo, but honestly, from the early 80s, I'm quite surprised at how well this is tuned. This is really nice to drive. I was expecting this to be a bit of a nightmare. It is not. Nice and small, so we can lean over and put up our windows with no problem, even though they are not electronic. Now we've got our windows up. Let's get the earmuffs off. You don't need the extra buffer. We're good to go. It does, however, feel like it's geared for acceleration because I'm in 5th gear right now. That's top gear at 55 miles an hour. We're already turning about 3,200 RPM. So if you are, doing a long highway commute, you're going to be revving this thing out quite a bit. I don't know if any of the gearing was touched. I don't think so. That's probably just the way a GTI is geared. But, it's not a highway monster. It's a little city hot hatch. But it'll still get the job done, and probably very efficiently. Visibility, what a treat. I gotta say, I know this is not the most relatable statement, but I was driving an Aventador for the last 4 days. And to be able to look over my shoulder and see the world, kind of a nice thing. I do enjoy visibility. Jump off over here. God, I love a hot hatch. Not something I would ever expect to feel in a GTI. Torque at the front wheels, that's incredible. Thing cruises right along. I think my favorite part about this car is just the fact that it doesn't feel like a tuner car. Down low, normal driving, I don't feel like I've lost anything. It doesn't feel like, oh, we've turbocharged it, so now the bottom end or the low end of the power band is all wonky and weird. It drives like a normal GTI. It just happens to have a boatload of power and torque up top. You've heard me say this a million times, but I gotta say, a low power, and for this it's a high power GTI, but 200 horsepower, we're not talking about a supercar here. This is just enough thrill to really enjoy yourself on a public road where otherwise you'd probably be getting speeding tickets, you might get yourself into some trouble. I don't live in an area where I'm able to really exploit a Lamborghini or an R8 on the daily. I've got to go somewhere for it. Whereas if you owned this, every time you got to run to CVS or whatever store, I shouldn't be advertising for them. Anytime you got to run to the store, you jump in this and you're going to have a great time. And I can really picture the next owner of this car being somebody who has a bunch of supercars or ridiculously fast cars and then goes off and buys this because it's as analog and fun an experience you can have. It's, it might be a little trite to say, but it's a bit like a go-kart. You can just jump in and rip around in it without too much concern. Watch out for the sand. Don't want to understeer this pristine car into the neighbor's house. So unless you go like the Caterham route where, you know, you have another little 4-cylinder, but no real room for storage, is very impractical, and you can't really drive it in the rain, I think this is the next best thing. I think you buy yourself a 1980s hot hatch, and hopefully it's got a turbo on it to make it especially fun. Now, the driving dynamics are really interesting because it does handle very well. It's a pretty balanced car, and it's quite entertaining. The limits are higher than you'd expect, and it's a light car, so you can really push it through a corner. It's a momentum car, though, regardless of the additional power you've got. What's interesting, too, is that this shifter, it feels so good in the hand, but oddly enough, it's very low in the car. I mean, modern cars make a pretty big deal of putting the shifter kind of as close to the steering wheel as possible, whereas this is way down. It's almost below the seat. So when you're going for second gear, you pretty much got your hand against your seat as you're going for it. Shocked by how smooth this engine feels. Don't know why I thought this car was going to be a letdown. I mean, not a letdown, but I just didn't expect it to be this good, honestly. Never expected to hear such outrageous wastegate noises coming from this car. What a hoot. Gotta give some credit to Callaway here for, you know, they were building some pretty outrageous stuff in the 80s, and the fact that they had an option to be able to turbocharge a GTI, that tells me they were more than just about power. They were about fun. They wanted to have a good time. 14-inch wheels are pretty small, but that means we've got this nice juicy sidewall. So what's great about the GTI is, even though it is a little car, it'll soak up the bumps, you know, through the suspension, but also through the sidewall of these tires, because they're 185/60s. So there's quite a bit. What's nice though is that there's not like a whole bunch of sidewall to settle in either, just because there's still little wheels. Everything happens reasonably fast when you turn the wheel. So that's the Callaway Stage 2 Turbo Volkswagen Rabbit GTI. I feel so fortunate to have been able to drive this car. This is a weird one, and probably the lowest mileage example of this in the world. So thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thank you to Bond Group in Waltham, Massachusetts for the opportunity to drive such a special little hatchback. And of course, thank you to the Patreon supporters for making this content possible. Don't forget to respect the drive, and I'll see you in the next one. I'm most impressed by the fact that the drivability was not negatively impacted by the attachment of a turbocharger. Like, it still feels very nimble, and the throttle response is immediate. It's very intuitive. I think anyone can jump in this car and just adapt to it immediately, rather than having to figure it out. I mean, I really have only put a couple miles on this car, and I feel right at home.